Good morning. I said in my teaser a little while ago that I was in an undisclosed location. I'm in my happy place. I'm at the beach now. I'm near Avon, North Carolina. I don't know if you can tell this, but it's blowing hard out here, and hopefully the wind won't mess up the sound too much or blow my stuff away. I've got a good second cup of coffee. This one is the Orange Blossom Cafe. They're in Buxton. If you're up here, you got to go by there. Good coffee and apple uglies. But I'm going to talk about something a lot more important than coffee and apple uglies. Continuing on a series of discussions about the various Bible translations. And this morning, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the translation that I use the most, and it's not the best one. I'm not going to say that it's the best one, but it works for me. It might work for you. It may not work for you. I've said all along that there is no one best translation. It's a matter of which one works best for you for what you're using it for. But the English Standard Version is the one that I tend to use the most. It's not the only one that I use, but it's the one that I tend to use the most. This is a translation that one of my seminary professors put me on to a few years ago. Dr. Merwin Johnson, a theology professor at Erskine then, put me on to the ESV, and I've liked it. So a little bit about this is we'll pop the hood on this one. The ESV is sort of like the New Revised Standard last week. It's a revision of the older Revised Standard Version. If you may have one of these laying around your house, a Revised Standard Version of the Bible. It was done in 1952 and then tweaked a little bit in 1971. The Revised Standard Version. The Revised Standard Version, it did, like I mentioned last week, it did upset some people with how it handled Old Testament prophecies, particularly Isaiah 7:14, where it referred to a young woman will conceive rather than a virgin will conceive and bear a son. Which is correct, is sort of a matter for is a different discussion altogether. But that did upset some people, and in the late 1980s, a committee gathered to begin working on a revision to the Revised Standard Version, and that would become the NRSV, and I talked about that last week. Well, the English Standard Version comes sort of as a separate revision of the RSV. Crossway Publishing bought the rights to the Revised Standard Version in the mid-90s, and they began, which gave them authority, legal right to revise the Revised Standard Version. And the result is the ESV. In particular, the editors of the ESV felt like the NRSV from last week had gone too far with gender-inclusive language, and they also felt like the Old Testament portions could be handled better, make them more messianic. And the result was the ESV. It was translated in the late 1990s and first published in 2001. Like most translations, it's the result of a committee. It's the result of a committee of scholars. Pretty much every notable translation that's worth reading is going to be the result of a committee, and committee where you can look up to know who actually did the work. The English Standard Version did make use of the most recent Greek editions of the New Testament, which would mean the oldest manuscript evidence for the New Testament, which would have been even superior to what was available at the time of the RSV was done in 1952, and light years better than what was available when the King James was done 400 years ago. Also, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the late 40s, too late to be of any use for the translators of the RSV, but the editors and translators of the ESV were able to make use of the Dead Sea Scrolls. For that matter, the NRSV was able to make use of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So a couple of things if you're curious about the ESV. How you handle gender language is a big deal in Bible translations, and there's no way that you're going to handle it that is going to make everybody happy. The NRSV went one direction, which made a lot of people happy, and if you stick hard line in the other way, you're not going to make people happy. There's no way to make everybody happy with it. The ESV handled it this way. In the New Testament, Paul, in all of his letters, refers to my brothers in such and such city. And literally, it is brothers. But the Greek word there, adelphoi, really can mean brothers, biological brothers, or it can mean broader brothers and sisters. The NRSV, just everywhere that's used, just has brothers and sisters. The ESV uses brothers, but in a footnote at the bottom of the page has brothers, has something to the effect of that word can also be used to refer to brothers and sisters in a non-sibling relationship. So they do that. A lot of places where the King James or even the Revised Standard would use the generic term man. The ESV will use person. They'll use someone or person. Pardon me, it's blowing hard out here and I'm sand in my face. And so they do that rather when it's clear that the word is referring to a generic human being. They'll use person or one, something like that, rather than man. They tend to use masculine pronouns, which isn't a big deal, but that's how they thought best to handle gender issues in the language. Is better than what was done with the RSV or the King James, but not nearly as far towards gender inclusivity as the NRSV. So the strengths of this particular version, this particular translation, it is fairly literal. It's a fairly literal translation of the Bible. It is so. If you got this continuum of word for word and thought for thought, it's over on this end here as a fairly literal translation. It works well if you're studying. If you're studying the Bible, you need something that's going to be fairly literal, that's going to be over on this side of the spectrum. Thought for thought translations don't work well for careful study. Everything has its own use. The ESV it maintains some of the phrasing, some of the cadence of the King James, more so than the New Revised Standard does, and that gives it a certain amount of elegance. and of course a term like elegance is always in the eye of the beholder, but it maintains some of the richness of the King James, but it doesn't have, obviously it doesn't have these and thous and thines and the ESTs and ETHs and stuff on the end of verbs. And so I think it works well for reading in public worship. There's certain elegance to it that I think works well for reading in public worship. It's fairly literal, so it works well for study. It's not going to be as easy to read as the NIV. If you're looking for a Bible to pick up and read before you go to bed at night, if you don't read that well, pick up an NIV or something more towards this end of the spectrum, because they would be easier for you to read. But the ESV works well for me. It's I can read it well, read it fine. It's good for careful study. It works well, in my opinion, for reading in public worship, which is obviously a pretty big deal in my calling. Not all translations work well for public worship. You wouldn't want to read the message from the pulpit. That's not going to work. But anyway, this is the ESV. It's a little more literal in the New Revised Standard Version from last week, and more literal in the NIV. Not quite as easy to read as the NIV, and because it maintains enough of the phrasing and the cadence from the King James, it's good for public worship. So it works for me, and it may work for you. If it does, that's great. If it doesn't, that's okay too. There's no one version that is the best for everybody, but that is the ESV. And in case you're wondering, in a few minutes I'm going to be wheels up and I'll be back home, and we'll have our Ephesians Bible study this evening at 6:30, and hope I'll see some of you then. And next week I will probably pop the hood in the New American Standard. I'm not certain yet, but probably pop the hood in the New American Standard Bible. Y'all have a great day.